Chapter 7. Nick woke up a couple of times in the night, but only in a hazy, drifting way. Once it was because Vash had somehow gotten himself wedged so close to Nick's side that he was breathing directly into Nick's ear. Vash was a suggestible sleeper, so it was easy to nudge him up, roll over, and let him cling on as the big spoon. He mumbled a little in his sleep. True waking came more slowly. Nick became gradually aware that his back was getting cold. He fumbled at the top edge of the blanket to pull it higher, but it didn't fix anything. His mind dragged through the thick, syrupy edge of half-formed dreams, and he blearily began to realize that he could hear a quiet voice talking, barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you call me last night?" Pause. "But if you think it's them, it's better to be safe." Nick breathed in a little deeper, waking. He rubbed a finger into the corner of his closed eye. Okay. No, I get it, and thanks." His back was cold because Vash had moved away. Nick wriggled over to his other side and cracked his eyes open. Vash's back was to him. He was huddled up on the edge of the bed. "Be careful," Vash whispered. "You don't have to wait for me." "Okay. See you later." His shoulders shifted. There was a tiny clatter, as of a phone being set on a nightstand. Nick let out a long sigh. "Mornin'," he mumbled. Now that his eyes were squinted open, he could tell the light was starting to change. Shy of sunrise by a few minutes, but getting there. Vash rolled over. He looked bleary and soft with sleep, lips dry, hair a disheveled mess. "Sorry," he whispered. "Did I wake you up?" Nick hummed a negative, even though maybe Vash did. But even if it was the whispering or the phone ringing before that, Nick didn't care. He scooted closer, got his arm around Vash's waist and pulled him in, shoved his face into the pillow, and closed his eyes. He could hear Vash laughing softly at him, and felt fingers carved through his hair. "Gotta get up sometime," Vash told him. "No," Nick mumbled, deeply muffled. Vash put his face to the top of Nick's head and breathed out, long and steady. "'Kay," he said. Minutes passed. Nick dozed a little, but the sun had started its cruel creep upwards, and the changing light behind his eyelids dragged him upwards with it. Vash let out a gentle sigh. "Nick," he whispered. Can I tell you what I'm scared of?" Nick poked his face out of hiding and peered up at Vash, groggy. He made a worried noise. "Not you," Vash murmured. "Not this." He put a hand on Nick's scruffy cheek and ran his thumb under Nick's eye. He looked too sad and too tired for this early in the morning. Nick tightened his hold around Vash. It made his smile come out a little. Quietly, Vash said, "Knives used to run with some really bad people. We moved to May to get away from them, start over. But we're pretty sure he's got a stalker. One of them who found him." Vash's smile had faded again. His thumb kept caressing Nick's cheekbone. "I want to live my own life," he said, and Nick could hear how soul-deep the wrenching tear went. "I wish I could think he made his own choices and it's okay to make him live with the consequences, but I can't think that way." Vash's eyes were starting to water. Quavery, he said, "He's my brother. I don't want him to get hurt." "Hey," Nick rasped, and pulled Vash's face to his shoulder. He remembered this. Not sure if Vash was crying, but hugging him through the urge either way. He thought about knives. He tried not to hate knives for making Nick think about him, this total stranger who was rude and made bad choices, while all Nick wanted was to wake up with an amazing man. Boyfriend, right? Boyfriend. And maybe relive last night again while the sun rose. Against his neck, Vash wavered out. "I'm scared to leave him alone, but I want this. I want you. I want to spend time with you and come over and not worry that he'll—" He trailed off, definitely crying now. Nick felt a hot drop run down his skin. "What was the call about?" Nick asked quietly. Vash sniffed hard. "Just, noises. He heard noises last night. Footsteps at the back door." Nick closed his eyes and rubbed a hand between Vash's shoulders. Okay, that was legitimately terrifying. Some home invasion movie shit. So Vash was imagining his twin, his only family, the person he had started a new life for, alone in silent emptiness with only a couple of locked doors between him and a potential threat. All of Nick's irritation at Knives drained away, replaced entirely by empathy for Vash. "Vash," Nick said, "I'm not going anywhere, okay? I'm not going to be jealous of the time you need to spend with him, or anything you need to do to protect your family. You can't run me off." Vash had stilled in his arms, breath still shaky, but listening. "And I will do anything I can to help. Anything, I mean it. If Knives needs a bodyguard, I'll damn well do it. Don't know what use I'd be, but I'd go home with you and keep watch all night if it meant you could sleep better." The shakiness was back, harder. Vash let out a wet, gulping sniff and raised his face to Nick's, pressing foreheads together. "How are you so good?" he asked, as bewildered as he was sincere. The only response Nick could think of was to kiss him. As sweeping romantic gestures went, it was somewhat undercut by Vash's runny nose and both of their morning breath, but it got the point across. Vash went back to hugging after a moment, and they laid there for a while longer, huddled against the world while the sun came up. Eventually, Vash sniffed heavily and moved away so he could scrub his face into his shoulder. Nick roused himself enough to pass Vash some tissues from the box on the nightstand. He sat up, glared at the sunny window. "What time's it?" Vash asked, already reaching for his phone to check. "In a rush?" "Bus schedule," Vash said. "What?" Nick turned his glare on Vash. "Don't be stupid, I'll give you a ride." Vash smirked and chuckled in a way that told Nick he was at least recovered enough from the scary phone call to laugh at accidental dirty jokes, so Nick didn't feel bad about it when he whacked Vash lightly with a pillow. Vash squawked, "Hey!" And like that, the morning was all good again. Reluctantly, they got up. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Vash let out an enormous yawn. "I should... sorry." He paused to scratch the corner of his eye. "Should, shower before I put my arm on." Nick shouldn't laugh, but it was a damn funny sentence out of context, and Vash snickered along with him. Slyly, Nick asked, "You want to see if we fit in there together?" Vash was up like a shot. Half an hour later, they were both nominally cleaner, but also out of breath, red-faced, and spent. "So much for short showers to save the environment," Vash laughed, leaning back against the shower wall with Nick pressed up against him. "Environment's overrated," Nick said, flicking water out of his eyes. "No," Vash complained, but it was undercut by his laughter. Eventually, they managed to keep their hands off each other long enough to dry off and get dressed. Nick rushed through his normal morning routine, conscious that Vash needed time elsewhere. His hair would just have to get blast-dried by a morning drive without a helmet. Nick got back into the bedroom in time to watch Vash expertly attach his own arm. He pulled something like a sock over the end of the stump, hoisted the whole mechanism into place, and held one strap in his teeth while he flipped the other one around his back, leaning to let gravity also do the work. He effortlessly caught both ends and worked the fastener one-handed. Once the prosthetic was in place and able to be moved with tension lines and muscle control, Vash used both hands to settle the harness more comfortably. Nick told him, "It's hot how good you are at that," and Vash flushed bright red. On the way out, Vash told him, "You don't have to take me home, you're going to be so late." And Nick told him to shush and kissed him for emphasis. Once again, Nick passed Vash's helmet and put on his own sunglasses instead. Vash's frown was truly unamused for once. "The more we do this, the more I hate you not wearing one," he said. Nick conceded the point. He wasn't thrilled about it either. "I'll get another one before the next time I drive you anywhere," he promised. There was a dealership on the highway out of town that seemed like a likely spot to find equipment. He might even take a trip down there this afternoon, if meetings allowed. Before they left, Vash gave him directions. There was no way to shout them through the helmet, over the wind. The directions took them to an odd cul-de-sac of a neighborhood. Nick missed a turn once because a street sign was half devoured by a bush, which he was sure was against some kind of road ordinance. But eventually he managed to get into the right area, where the speed limit was slow enough for Vash to holler and be heard. It was a neighborhood of houses, not apartments, all densely packed in with trees. But it didn't give the impression of wealth like a lot of areas with standalone houses and greenery. It wasn't manicured enough, its roads weren't cared for, its houses were too small. Several side streets and driveways they passed were gravel or dirt, not paved. It looked old, probably part of the original footprint of May City before a century of urban sprawl. Vash squeezed his shoulder and pointed, and Nick rolled to a stop in front of a small, slightly peeling white house with the yard absolutely exploding with flowers. He turned down the short gravel driveway and pulled up into the carless spot near the front door. Vash hopped off the bike and emerged from the helmet, his hair even more screwed up than usual because he'd gone in damp. He scrubbed it with a hand and shook his head like a dog, making it worse. "Good morning," called a little old voice. Nick whipped around and spotted a little old neighbor going to get her mail. Vash muttered, then pasted on his biggest smile and waved. "Morning, Mrs. Ellis." She waved back, and it could not be more obvious that she was staring at Nick. Black suit, black motorcycle, black sunglasses, dark skin. He raised his glasses to the top of his head and gave her a winning smile and little wave, and she suddenly discovered something else in her mailbox that needed her attention. "Well, there goes the gossip chain," Vash said. "You want to come inside?" "Yeah," said Nick. "I'm taking you to work too, you know. Not just going to run off without you." Vash looked sheepish but pleased. He led Nick up the front steps, digging keys out of the pocket of his red coat. Nick looked around at the flower explosions. He couldn't name any of them, but he could tell Vash's green thumb had been all over them. 2 locks, doorknob and deadbolt. Vash shouldered his way in, the door sticking and creaking a little, and Nick cautiously stepped in behind him. It was somehow both exactly what he'd expected and nothing like Vash. Maybe the influence of his brother? Either way, the living room was full of greenery, which tracked with Vash, but much of the plant life was in the form of meticulously organized, gridded trays under racks of lights, with labels sticking out of every inch of soil, and charts on the walls behind them full of numbers Nick didn't understand. "Sorry," Vash said, sliding a table covered in seedlings to the side to give a few more inches of through space. "Sometimes his crossbreeding experiments get out of hand." "Kinda cold for starting new things?" Nick asked uncertainly. "Not with grow lamps in a greenhouse," Vash said, cheery. The only concession to human life in the living room was a sofa and an old TV, and a shelf made of milk crates absolutely packed with DVD cases. Vash went on through the next door, into the kitchen, which was clearly where a lot more actual living went on. The top of the fridge and the tops of all the cabinets were packed with empty glass jars, but the counters and dining table looked like almost normal people lived here. It smelled like fresh coffee. Vash went to the coffee pot on the counter and plucked a sticky note off of it. "Aw," he said, reading it and smirking. "He's such an asshole." Said with all the affection of a true brother. Vash stuck the note back on the counter and pulled another one off of a pad nearby, picked up a stray pen, and doodled something. Nick wandered over to look. Vash had drawn a spiky-haired cartoon of himself making a rude face, with "Kiss my ass" scrawled under it. In neat, small handwriting, the original note read, "If he smokes in my house, I will put sugar in his gas tank." Nick snorted. "Noted," he said. "I'll try not to piss Knives off." "Yeah, but you know he's really saying he figured you'd come over, and he left extra coffee for us," Vash said. He opened a cabinet. "Mugs, if you want," he said. "And there's soy creamer in the fridge. I'll be a minute. You're welcome to look around." He gave Nick a goofy little grin and dodged off. Nick stood there uncertainly for a moment, looking around. Then, he figured, probably best to accept the peace offering from the scary twin, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The bag of beans was on the counter nearby. Organic, of course, from some local roaster. Nick was half surprised they didn't grow their own. He drank his coffee black anyway, so he wandered out of the kitchen with the mug. It had a rainbow on it. He peered down the hallway where Vash had gone. It was a relatively small house, with no second floor. He'd guessed no more than 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. To his right was a closed door, no decoration on it. Further down and to the left was a door covered with a big painting of some kind of red flowers, standing ajar, with the flailing Vash just visible inside. Nick took a few steps closer, grinning and watching Vash get something in his prosthetic caught in his shirt sleeve. He struggled with it, cursing constantly under his breath. Vash's bedroom looked more like the kind of disaster area Nick would have expected. Books stacked on the floor instead of on shelves, a windowsill completely blocked up with succulents, a desk fully covered with tchotchkes, and a chair piled with clothes. Vash caught sight of him. "Don't laugh at me," he said, pouting. "Need help?" "No." Vash got the sleeve unstuck and pulled the fresh shirt on with a huff. He started buttoning it. "So, no smoking in the house," Nick said. "Any chance of Angelina getting shanked if I smoke outside?" Vash huffed a laugh. "I think you're good. I won't let Knives murder your bike. The other door out of the kitchen goes out back." He finished his shirt and scrubbed a hand through his product-free hair. "I'll give you and your hairdo some time alone," Nick said, and Vash stuck his tongue out at him. So Nick took his coffee out the back door. The yard was small, but made even smaller by how crowded it was with plants. Whereas out front was all flowers, this was all practical garden. Nick thought he recognized basil in one bed, so assumed the other stuff there to be herbs as well. Half a dozen other chunks of yard were marked off with landscape timbers, leaving narrow walking space between beds. Some of them were full of vegetable plants that looked on the verge of death. It was getting colder at night, after all. And some of them were full of huge, tangled masses that it took Nick a minute to realize were pumpkin vines. He ducked down to look under the leaves and spotted a couple of orange beach balls under there, happily growing away. A tiny flagstone patio took up no more than 10 square feet from the back door. There was a small glass-top table, 2 nice but uncomfortable-looking wrought iron chairs, and 1 big Adirondack lounger off to the side. Nick took one of the chairs. A thin seat cushion at least kept it from being freezing cold on his ass. He lit up and let the smoke warm him while he looked around and pondered Vash's problem. Well, Knives' problem. The whole neighborhood was tightly interwoven, with lots of shrubs and cover. Plenty of places a stalker could watch someone without being seen by their intended target, sure. But by the same token, it was hard to imagine any one spot that was out of all sightlines. The houses were too close together, all the fences between yards just 4-foot chain link. No one could feasibly hang around and watch one house without being seen from the windows of a dozen others. And Nick had been here for all of 5 seconds before meeting a nosy neighbor. Prowling at night was the obvious answer. Keep to shadows, avoid lit windows. Most of the backyards were fenced, but even if they had locked gates, jumping them would be easy. No spiked finials or privacy fences anywhere in sight, just short barrier markers. Pretty much there to tell a homeowner what grass they were supposed to mow. Nick drank the last of his coffee and used the empty mug to tap ashes into while he thought. He had some obvious, top-of-the-head questions for Vash which he wasn't looking forward to asking, because he already suspected the answers. A few minutes later, Vash opened the back door and stuck his head out. "You want any breakfast?" he asked. "All the options are vegan." "We're already both late," Nick said. "What about going to Cheryl and Lena's?" Vash's expression got all gooey and heart-stricken. Nick's heart skipped a beat when the L word threatened at the edge of his mind. It was kind of soon for that, right? Nick had never believed in at first sight. Not that 4 months was first sight. Not that Nick didn't believe in it at all, either. He just knew and accepted that it was a lot of work, that it shouldn't be taken lightly, that it took time, that, well, most importantly, that he wasn't good at it. That he'd tried before, and he'd always screwed it up. He had to stop. He made himself stop. He went back inside, rinsed his mug while Vash finished putting odds and ends in his pockets. They left out the front. Nick got the bike started, Vash locked the house. Then Nick found his helmet being shoved into his hands. "Your turn," Vash said, and hopped onto the seat behind Nick. "Hey," Nick objected. "Driver sets the rules." "I want the driver to stay alive," Vash retorted. "This is just because you don't want to squash your hair. Leave my hair alone and try having a sense of self-preservation for once." Nick scoffed, but he caved and put the helmet on. He was pretty tired of getting bitch-slapped by the wind anyway. Once they picked up speed, Vash yelped and hid his face in Nick's back. Nick could feel his hot breath on his neck. Memories of last night kept threatening to resurface, and Nick had to agree with the Vash of about 12 hours ago. How the hell was he supposed to just go to work and act normal? Jesus, the whole office was going to clock him within 5 minutes. He'd better brace for Livio's overly enthusiastic demands for details. Even if they'd wanted to keep this new development a secret, there was no escaping their coworkers. As soon as Nick parked by the funeral home, they both spotted Kite, working outside in the garden center's parking lot, standing and pointing straight at them. Vash made a beleaguered noise. As they headed around the sidewalk in the direction of the bakery, Kite blew a hellacious whistle with his fingers in his mouth. Vash flipped him the bird with his right hand, smacking his left in the inside of his other elbow. "You can't do a double bird?" Nick asked, grinning. "You have no idea how much I wish I could," Vash sighed. Across the street, Kite made an explicit hand gesture back. Nick raised a middle finger of his own in solidarity with Vash. Once they got there, the bakery was so busy that Vash didn't get a chance to do much except wave at Cheryl through the kitchen door. Lena was working the counter. When Vash and Nick got to the front of the line, she said, "What'll it be, Eric's?" Vash groaned. "Not again," he whined. Lena gave a toothy grin. I'm afraid to ask, Nick said. Eric's. Vash ordered, sounding defeated. Before Lena could ring him up, he poked a finger at Nick and said, On me. Come on. Vash made a sharp little shut-up noise. On me. So Nick ordered his black coffee and breakfast sandwich while Lena looked at them curiously. But the line was long and she didn't have time to grill them. They picked their way to a small window table. Fess up, Eric's, Nick said as he sat down. Don't you start, Vash pouted. One time I was in a hurry and picked up the wrong guy's order off the counter, okay? One time. Bet his name was written on it. Right out in plain sight. I can read, Vash grumbled. I just didn't. Ugh. Lena decided I must either answer to that name or be illiterate then. Nick laughed. Vash pouted harder. Breakfast was over far too soon, even though the clock declared it was perilously close to 9. As they sat there nursing the last dregs of their coffees, finally accepted that they needed to go back to their respective jobs, Vash said, I'm really happy right now. Just want you to know that. Nick looked up at him and ached. Me too, he said. I can't... Vash let out a long breath. I can't come over every night, but I'll text. You'll get sick of me. Doubt it, said Nick. Listen, I feel like I probably shouldn't even ask if you've gone to the police. Vash wasn't stupid. He'd already have done whatever he could. Vash scratched the side of his nose, expression dimming to a careful neutral. Not yet. He tapped his coffee cup. There isn't anything to go on but a hunch, and knowing the people Knives used to... knowing what they're like. He paused for a long moment, not meeting Nick's eyes. Finally, very quiet, he said, Police might ask Knives and I about how he knew them. Not safe to answer, Nick guessed, not really a question. Especially not after we cross state lines to move, Vash muttered, and knocked back the end of his coffee. Nick nodded. Okay. Don't tell me. Or if you're gonna tell me anything, do it in person, don't text it. Nick swirled the last of his coffee around the bottom of his cup. I have late nights most of this week, but Friday's free. He looked up. Vash's expression bloomed back into a slow smile. I'll see if I can make room in my schedule, he said dryly. You better, Nick told him, grinning back. Jessica gave Nick a strained smile when he finally came in. Nick did feel bad for her, but not even a little bit sorry. She'd made her choices and pined in silence. Not his problem. Still, he wouldn't gloat or anything. Brad nodded at him in the kitchen when he went to fill up on coffee. I guess things are good? Brad asked, a little stiffly. Yeah, said Nick, sipping from his mug. Turns out actually talking to people works. He raised a pointed eyebrow at Brad, whose face went sour and pinched. Nick patted him on the shoulder and left him in peace. It was 3 whole hours before trouble found him. Nick was outside having his lunchtime smoke break when the carport door flung open. Nicholas, said a dangerous, sing-songy voice. Oh no, Nick muttered, drawing hard on his cigarette in an attempt to finish it faster. I've heard a rumor, said Livio, hopping down the steps to the concrete parking area. Nick stubbed out the butt in the ashtray he was holding and tried to sidle away toward the cracked-open supply closet. Never trust those, he said. Don't run off, lover boy, Livio said, grinning. He rounded the hearse. What? Nah. Nick shoved the ashtray back onto the shelf where it lived, pulled the door closed. He darted around the other end of the hearse. Don't know what you're... Showed up late with a gardener, Livio said, dodging around faster than Nick could hope to move. When were you going to tell me? Nick put in one solid final dash, but Livio was a linebacker in all but name. He caught Nick by the waist and immediately got him in a noogie-vulnerable headlock. Ack! Nick yelped, fighting to escape. He'd forgotten what it was like to have an annoying kid brother around all the time. Quit it, you freaking gorilla! Kiss and tell, Livio demanded gleefully. Ow! Let go! Fine! Livio cackled while Nick tugged his clothes straight and tried to fix his wild hair. Nick told him, You're insufferable, you know that? Livio slapped his back too hard, grinned like a fool, and said, Love you too, Nico-Nee. And Nick grumbled, fished out and lit another cigarette despite his best intentions of only coming outside for one, and settled against the van to let himself be grilled by his old sibling about his new boyfriend. May was a big city, but damn did Nick's bubble inside it feel small town.